Okay, hello. Welcome to Lecture 11 in Modern Political Theory. This is a fresh start for us. We've spent the first part of the semester reading three authors, two Englishmen and a Genevan, all of whom have invested heavily in a philosophical idea of the social contract, and they've approached political theory through that lens. Today and for the next 3 weeks, the next 6 lectures, we're going to be looking at a very different tradition of modern political thinking, that of classical utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism gets going in the 18th century with Jeremy Bentham. There are some important forerunners, Helvetius in France, William Paley in England, and the Scottish philosopher David Hume about more later. But Bentham is generally regarded as the pioneer figure who really got the tradition going. You see an image of him there on the right. What you're looking at, you may know this, is Bentham's mummified body with a waxwork head on the top of it. As you may know, Bentham gave his body to medical science and requested that his mummified body be preserved. And even today, if you visit University College London, if you go in through the main lobby, the main entrance to the Senate House at University College London, there's a little booth on the left, and Bentham with his waxwork head is sitting there. The head, as I say, is a waxwork image. The original head is still in existence, and University College London still has it, but it's not doing so well, so they commissioned Madame Tussauds or somebody to put a waxwork head on him. There he is. He occasionally is wheeled into University College London council meetings where he sits in attendance. You can see there his little name tag, Professor Jeremy Bentham. So he's sitting there at the table where the UCL Council meets. The relationship between University College London and Jeremy Bentham is a little bit like the relationship between the University of Virginia and Thomas Jefferson. As I say, utilitarianism gets going in the 18th century, but it becomes really very dominant, especially in the English-speaking world in the 19th century. And in fact, it still has considerable influence today, although there's been among contemporary political philosophers quite a strong reaction against classical utilitarianism, especially thanks to the work of the American philosopher John Rawls, whom I mentioned in my lectures on Rousseau. Utilitarian ideas are still very much in circulation. If you go to a public policy school, you'll be taught, like the Batten School, you'll be taught an awful lot of cost-benefit analysis, and cost-benefit analysis is clearly in a direct line from classical utilitarianism for reasons that will emerge. And of course, much of modern economics still speaks the language of utilitarianism. Any of you who've taken introductory courses in economics will know that modern economists talk all the time about utility, individual utility functions. They talk all the time about optimizing welfare, maximizing aggregate benefit. And that whole lexicon comes straight from the classical utilitarians, goes all the way back to Bentham in the 18th century. Utilitarianism isn't just different from social contract theory, it grows out of a conscious reaction against and a rejection of social contract theory. And the key figure in pushing the discussion, at least in the Anglophone world, away from social contract theory is David Hume, who lived from 1711 to 1776. Normally in this course, I would devote a separate week to Hume, but because we have a slightly truncated semester because of COVID, I decided to nix him from the syllabus as a separate figure, so I haven't asked you to read any Hume. But I do want to spend at least the first part of today's lecture reviewing some relevant aspects of Hume's thought to help explain why the utilitarian tradition arose in reaction to social contract theory, which Hume and others came to regard with skepticism. So I'm going to spend the first part of this lecture talking about Hume, how he influences Bentham, and then I'll start to talk about Bentham's own ideas in the latter half of the lecture. So I already hinted at this in some of the remarks I made about Rousseau. But one of Hume's most important contributions to modern political theory is in a very powerful critique of the entire tradition of natural law theory and the associated idea that individuals have certain natural rights. You know, for Hobbes and Locke, this idiom of natural law and the idea that individuals have certain basic human or natural rights, that's an absolutely central component of classical social contract theory, at least the 17th century variants. But as I mentioned when I was talking about Rousseau, in the 18th century, people start to become skeptical of the idea that there are really natural rights. And of course, as I also mentioned, I think in the last lecture, one of them, Bentham is one of the strongest critics, right? Bentham calls the idea of natural rights nonsense, or nonsense on stilts, as he sometimes says. And the move that Hume and also Rousseau make is in a funny kind of way actually an extension of and a radicalization of one of Hobbes's main claims. Hobbes, of course, famously said, the state is artificial. It's a social construction. But Rousseau and also Hume, and really Hume is the guy who should get most of the credit for this, Hume radicalizes Hobbes's thought by saying, well, if that's true of the state, then it must be true of rights too. Rights are purely conventional. They're purely artificial. They're not things that exist by nature. We have to think of them as existing, if they exist at all, because there's some set of conventions, either moral conventions or social norms, or some more formal system of institutions that confer those rights, especially legal rights, on people. But until you have a law, or until you have some conventional scheme of social or moral norms, it doesn't, that are humanly constructed, it doesn't make sense to postulate rights. He also, Hume, rejects another claim that is associated with the tradition of natural law theory, and which is implicit in a great deal of what Locke and Hobbes say, that our reason can tell us what we ought to do, or how we ought to act, how we ought to conduct ourselves, right? If you ask a traditional natural law theorist, either Locke or Hobbes, or going further back into the medieval Christian period, someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, if you ask them, well, how do we know what the natural law requires of us? They'll say, well, the natural law and its precepts are given to us by our reason. Right? As St. Paul in the Gospels said, it's engraved on our hearts, and all we need to do is to rationally introspect, and our reason will tell us that we already have certain natural duties, not to murder other human beings, not to wantonly kill innocent persons, not to break promises. We have a duty to try to be honest, not to defraud people, not to harm people wantonly, to be generous and kind rather than cruel. For all of the natural law thinkers, our reason tells us that these are already violations of a set of natural duties. And individuals have certain natural rights, as you know, in Hobbes and Locke, for example, not to be killed, not to be stolen from, not to be blamed when they take preemptive action to defend themselves, right? So it's an assumption of the natural law tradition that if you're trying to figure out what our basic moral duties are, we consult our reason, we introspect, and rational introspection will tell us, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not wantonly take other people's junk, right? Hume also rejects that view. He's very radical in this, and I hinted at this way, way back in one of the very first lectures I gave. I can't summarize the details of Hume's argument, but the underlying thought is this. And again, there's a grounding here in something that Hobbes has already anticipated. The idea that human beings ought to do certain things, Hume thinks, implies that they have some kind of motive for complying, right? But like Hobbes, Hume says, well, our motives must ultimately be determined not by something rational, not by our reason, but ultimately have to be motivated by desires and emotions and passions and our sentiments, right? If you think about Hobbes, right, this whole story in the first part of Leviathan about the role that our appetites and aversions play in causing us to describe certain things as good and bad, or as morally right, or as morally evil. And Hume deeply radicalizes that idea. He says, look, our reason doesn't motivate us. It's not by, doing logic or engaging in rational reflection that we are motivated to do things. We're only ever motivated to do things because we desire certain things, or we have strong aversions against certain things. So he's committed to the idea that when we use the language of ought and should, the idea that we have certain ethical imperatives, we must be talking about something that ultimately has its root in our emotions and our desires. And he distinguishes our emotions and our desires from rational reflection. And if you put those two things together, Hume winds up with a deeply skeptical conclusion about the natural law, natural rights tradition. We don't have any natural rights, and our reason won't tell us that we have natural duties to do certain things, or natural duties to respect certain supposedly natural rights. According to Hume, that's all a load of nonsense. And of course, if you get rid of the notion that individuals have certain natural rights in, for example, a state of nature, then the whole idea that Hobbes and Locke had emphasized, that states get instituted as a result of a social contract in which individuals give up or surrender or transfer their natural rights, that whole assumption collapses, and with it the whole edifice of social contract theory. Now, Rousseau, as you know, offers a kind of revised version of social contract theory that doesn't really rely heavily on the notion of natural rights. So it's kind of an open question whether Hume's objections to natural rights theory really reach Rousseau. But I think it's still worth mentioning that Hume's critique was very, very successful in convincing generations of political theorists to drop social contract theory. And in fact, at least in the English-speaking world, the idea of a social contract basically goes out of circulation. It only gets revived in any philosophically systematic way again in the 1970s with the writings again of John Rawls. But between the middle of the 18th century and the last part of the 20th century, social contract ideas of a Lockean and a Hobbesian sort are really a dead duck. They're just not taken seriously. So you won't find any major 19th or early 20th century theorists of the social contract. There just aren't any, because people were persuaded by Hume's very powerful objections that the underlying assumptions on which social contract theory rests are completely bankrupt. So Hume reaches the conclusion that we can't appeal to natural reason, we can't appeal to ideas about the natural law, we can't postulate the existence of certain natural rights to help us understand how we ought to act. None of these ideas are going to be helpful, he wants to say, in explaining why and on what terms we should accept and obey the authority of states. None of them are going to help us understand the requirements of justice, where those requirements are understood, broadly speaking, as Hobbes and Locke had understood them. That is, in terms of keeping our promises and contracts, respecting the rights of others, especially, as in the case of Locke, the rights of private property holders. But that, of course, leaves him with a puzzle, and he goes on to ask, so if the natural law and our natural reason can't shed any light on these questions, why is it that we have the conviction that human beings have certain duties to act virtuously, to avoid vices, that it's ethically important to obey the law, to keep our promises and contracts, to respect private property, and so forth. Where does that conviction come from? And Hume treats this question as a scientific question, as an explanatory or descriptive question. You've got to remember, Hume is writing at the height of the European Enlightenment, this burst of intellectual activity that occurs in various places, Scotland in particular, but more broadly in France and Germany, continental Europe, and to a lesser extent in England. This burst of intellectual activity that is inspired by especially the achievements of Isaac Newton in the 17th century, the previous century, right? And Hume is one of those who is deeply impressed by Newton's accomplishments in physics, in optics, and the natural sciences more generally. And like a lot of his Enlightenment contemporaries, he thinks that Newton's method is worth emulating in other areas. So if you pick up a copy of Hume's first great work, his Treatise of Human Nature, and look at the frontispiece, the front cover, you'll see that there is an allusion right there on the cover page to this book, the treatise, being an effort to apply Newton's methods to ethics, morality, and society more generally. He wants to extend the Newtonian method outside narrower spheres like physics and into the social and ethical sphere. And that's very much his inspiration. So he treats this question about where do our convictions about what we ought to do, our convictions about vice and virtue, he treats this question about where this all comes from as a scientific question, as something that requires a scientific explanation. If you want a good analogy here, think about Darwin. Of course, Darwin is coming later in the 19th century, but Darwin is asking a similar kind of question, because Darwin is interested in the question, why does speciation occur, right? You look out at the animal kingdom, the biological world more generally, and one of the things that strikes us is that life takes many, many different forms. What accounts for this variegation? Why is it that life takes these many different forms? Why does it proliferate into different species that we can nonetheless classify under certain general headings, right? So, you know, we don't have just one kind of mammal. We have blue whales, we have different kinds of whales, humpback whales, we have elephants, we have stoats, we have otters. We have many, many different kinds of mammals. We have many different kinds of reptiles, many different kinds of insects, lots of different kinds of trees. And we can kind of classify these species according to their particular characteristics. And Darwin's question is, where does all of this speciation come from? Where does this variegation originate? What causes it? And of course, his answer, Darwin's answer, is this theory of natural selection. And the basic claim, you all know this, of course, is that as animals reproduce and as plants reproduce, they pass along various kinds of traits. And the traits that will tend to survive will be those traits that assist the relevant organism or plant in adapting to its particular conditions of life, right? So, you know, you find some lichen or moss, right, that flourishes in the Siberian tundra, and you'll be able to explain its particular characteristics in terms of a successful strategy for survival in the subarctic conditions of the Siberian tundra. And ditto for elephants' trunks, ditto for zebras' stripes, and any number of other traits that you observe and by which we distinguish different kinds of species, right? And Hume approaches this question about the origins of our moral attitudes and our moral beliefs, our beliefs about vice and virtue. He treats that question as in principle a question of the same kind. So his puzzle is what explains the human propensity to attach ethical import to certain actions and social practices, like respect for private property rights, the duty to keep your promises, and so on, and so forth. And Hume offers, just like Darwin offers his principle of natural selection as a theory that purports to explain speciation, Hume offers a similar, formally analogous hypothesis for the origins of our language of virtue and vice. What he says is basically this: what we human beings call virtues and vices, those kinds of actions, those kinds of institutions, those kinds of norms, those kinds of expectations, those sorts of social practices that we regard as morally good or morally bad, they reflect our observable tendency to do two things. On the one hand, to feel a certain kind of approval or disapproval when we encounter or witness the relevant conduct or practices. And secondly, given our natural propensity to have sympathy for the suffering of others. And this emphasis on sympathy is both very important for Hume's theory, but it's also going to be, as you'll see, quite important for the development of utilitarianism, because sympathy is, for Hume, a distinctive feature of human psychology, which he defines in the treatise. He talks about it also in the inquiries. He defines it as a capacity to, quote, receive by communication the inclinations and sentiments of others, however different or contrary to our own. And he's on to something that you're going to see later on in the course. Rousseau also picks up on in his second discourse. It's a phenomenon that they both notice, although they attach different terms to it. In Rousseau, the term that is used to describe this basically similar capacity is the French word pitié, which is related to, but it has a slightly different connotation from the English word pity. And what Hume and Rousseau are both picking up on is this natural propensity to encounter other animals, especially, or other sentient beings, and to be able to sympathize with their suffering, or indeed their happiness and joy and pleasure, right? So, we're on our way to class, and we come across on the street a dog on the side of the road. Perhaps it's been hit by a car or something, and it's clearly in pain. It's whimpering, it's twitching, there's blood coming out of its mouth. Sorry to be gory about this. And we quite naturally have an inclination to come to the dog's aid. And the important thing about this is not so much the question of whether every single human being will in fact be motivated in that sort of situation to help a wounded dog, or to conversely take great joy in the fact that the dog is enthusiastically wagging its tail and therefore giving every indication of being happy and contented. It's not so much that Hume thinks that every single one of us will react to this by actually doing something to help the dog. It's more that Hume thinks that we have a natural tendency to understand the meaning of the animal's behavior. And it will, in fact, Hume thinks, trigger a kind of sympathetic response in us, right? We'll feel something of the animal's pain, or we'll feel something of the animal's joy if they're jumping up and down because we're about to give it some food or something, right? And what he's getting at here is the thought that our sentiments and our passions and our desires and our feelings are in some sense interpersonally transparent, right? We can understand what another creature is going through because we have this natural sympathetic response to their suffering or pleasure. And this notion of sympathy plays a big role in his hypothesis, because he's going to ask questions like, well, why is it that we regard gratitude and benevolence as virtues, or as morally admirable, morally praiseworthy, and, for example, cruelty as a vice or as morally contemptible? Why do we have contempt for people who act cruelly? And Hume's answer is, because we sympathize with the pleasure or suffering of those who are affected by the relevant actions, right? When we see somebody else receiving benevolence and goodwill from another person, right, we are naturally sympathetically aroused by the benefits that the target receives. And that leads us to feel good. It leads us to feel approval of the actions that caused the relevant benefits to occur in another person. Similarly, with regard to a vice like cruelty, we have a sympathetic aversion to the suffering of a victim of cruelty, and that will lead us to disapprove of the behavior that results in that particular kind of suffering. And that's Hume's general hypothesis, put very, very simply. But Hume notices that this hypothesis about sympathy runs into difficulty when it applies to certain kinds of ethical conduct, and in particular to the ones that the natural lawyers were especially concerned with. For example, dispositions to keep promises, to act justly, give people what they're due in relation to some contract or promise or agreement, or people's dispositions to obey the law. These behaviors, even though we attach moral significance to them and even regard them as virtues, it's not the case that our sympathy is naturally excited by them. The sorts of examples that Hume has in mind here is think about Robin Hood, right? Robin Hood steals from the rich to give to the poor, right, in the legend. And of course, our sympathy, because Robin Hood is a hero, Walt Disney does movies about Robin Hood. Our tendency is, of course, naturally to sympathize with Robin Hood and the people that he's trying to help. But of course, if you remember that Robin Hood is stealing, he's an outlaw, right? He's stealing other people's property, right? Justice requires that he ought to return the goods that he's stolen from the rich to give to the poor. And it then becomes puzzling. Why do we regard the disposition to return the goods that Robin Hood has stolen to the wealthy? Why should that be, on Hume's hypothesis, something that we regard as a virtue, as ethically admirable, when our sympathies, as it were, are all with Robin Hood and the people he helps? The same is true for a lot of contracts. When I pay my mortgage payments every month, and in doing so, I'm keeping a promise that I made to my lender. But of course, it's painful every month for me to have to write out this big fat check to Chase Manhattan or whoever it is, and yet we regard compliance with that promise as ethically good, even though it's hard to understand why we would sympathize with my, subsidizing some over wealthy bank, right? Or simply following stupid or repressive laws, right? Why do we regard that as admirable when it's often really pointless, right? It's dark night in a desert zone, you can see for miles around, you pull up, you're the one driver driving around, and you come up to a traffic signal that goes red, and the law requires you to stop. But you can see there's no other cars around. Why don't you just run the red light? And a lot of us would say, well, there's something admirable about following the law nonetheless. But this seems pointless, and it's hard to see how our moral sentiments are particularly excited by the disposition of someone who just stops at a red light for the sake of it, right? So Hume notices that there's a problem about at least some of the things that we regard as admirable or virtuous and vicious, because they don't actually naturally excite our sympathy. And Hume gives a solution to this problem, which unfortunately I can't describe in great detail, because it's really, for our purposes, the upshot of his account that's important, not the details. What Hume says is, well, these particular kinds of cases are ones that we can describe in a somewhat different way. They're not natural virtues in the sense that our sympathies are naturally, by our basic hard wiring. They're not naturally behaviors that, through sympathetic observation of their effects excite good feelings and approval in us. Rather they're, as he puts it, artificial virtues. And what he means when he uses this language of artificiality here is something that's not a million miles away from Hobbes's notion of an artificial person, but it's different because it doesn't rest on anything conscious or designed. Because Hume says, well, look, as this human species develops and as social cooperation becomes ever more complex, certain kinds of patterns and habits and conventions get sedimented, right? So the convention that we keep our promises, the convention that we follow the law and obey, the convention that we recognize that other people have legal rights in their property, right? These gradually start to emerge just as unconscious habits. They emerge spontaneously and unintentionally, but they're completely socially constructed. They're not something anyone designs. They're not given by nature. They're just patterns of conduct that we find ourselves falling unintentionally into. But once they're in place and have become systematized, we're then in a position to see our social situation in a new light, and our sympathy now allows us to, and this is the key that provides the bridge to Bentham and the classical utilitarians, we're in a position now for the first time to see that on the whole, these practices themselves bring about certain kinds of benefits, right? We discover that actually, to sort of paraphrase Locke's argument, that conventions of private property ownership encourage things like commercial development and the enrichment of human society. We notice that promise keeping makes human life more predictable. We can make plans. We notice, as Hobbes did, that encouraging law-abiding dispositions tends to promote peace. And once we see that, which we're not going to be able to see, Hume thinks, until human society is developed to a certain point, we can then start to appreciate and see how others' welfare depends on these larger scale social practices. And our sympathy can then be excited by that recognition. And this is the key. We then come to see these practices, artificial as they are, as nonetheless having utility. And Hume uses the language of utility in this context. And that's, of course, really the beginning of the classical utilitarian position. Bentham was very impressed with Hume. He read Hume. He finds his attack on natural law to be extremely persuasive. Indeed, he talks about his reading of Hume as being a kind of Saul road to Damascus experience. He just says the scales fall from his eyes and he finally sees the truth. And he takes over this basic Humean analysis. In the text that I asked you to read for this first lecture, the text called Deontology, you see this very clearly in a passage on pages 278 to 9. Bentham says, men perceived such and such actions were useful. They perceived such and such other actions were mischievous. They took a particular action of the sort, for instance, that was mischievous. By abstracting them particular circumstances of time, of place, and parties, they formed a general idea. To that general idea they gave a name. That name constituted a genus, to which other acts of the same nature were referred in common. If anyone took into consideration that genus or species of action, no matter what we call it, and said of it that it was mischievous, that then formed a maxim of utility. And this is just straightforward Hume. So to see how this works, think of our conventional understanding of certain classes of actions that we regard as morally bad, like murder or fraud or rape. These are descriptions of general kinds of acts, right? I mean, there are many different, if you think about an individual rape, of course, it's going to be different, from the next rape or the next act of fraud or the next con or swindle or the next murder, all sorts of, particularities of circumstance. But we nonetheless have these general classifications of certain acts as murderous, as certain acts as acts of rape or as acts of fraud. And we form these general ideas of these notions And we come to an understanding that that general class of actions, in all three of these cases, that they tend to be disutile. They tend towards consequences that are very bad for people. And since we sympathize with the victims, right, we attach opprobrium, we attach disapproval to the relevant kinds of acts. And we gradually evolve an understanding of certain kinds of acts or act types whose propensity is to harm or to cause pain, and vice versa, right? Certain other kinds of acts, like acts of generosity, acts of kindness, expressions of gratitude, playful behavior, whatever it might happen to be, we notice that those classes of acts tend to produce pleasure in other people, and we accordingly classify them as morally good. And all of this Bentham basically takes over straightforwardly from Hume. Where he differs from Hume is that Bentham is much less of a kind of observing scientist than is Hume. In Hume, as I've said, all of this stuff about the development of our understanding of the virtues through the operation of this faculty of sympathy, this is canvassed by Hume simply as a descriptive account of how moral language and moral sensibility in fact develops. But Bentham wants to say, well, it doesn't only have a descriptive role. It's not just an accurate description of how human societies in fact classify different kinds of actions as morally good or morally bad. It also has a prescriptive role. Once we realize this, we can start looking forward and ask the question, well, what kinds of institutions, what kinds of practices, what kinds of conduct, ideally, should we encourage in people in order to promote utility? And you see this very clearly in the famous opening of Bentham's Principles of Morals and Legislation. Bentham says, nature has placed mankind under the governance of two sovereign masters, pain and pleasure. It is for them alone to point out what we ought to do, as well as to determine what we shall do. On the one hand, the standard of right and wrong, on the other, the chain of causes and effects are fastened to their throne. So when he says that this is not just something that has causal significance, but it's also something that provides a standard or a criterion by which we are to judge certain things as rationally good or bad for us, Bentham is extending Hume's analysis so that it's no longer a merely explanatory or descriptive hypothesis about how our moral sensibility in fact develops, and is radicalizing it into a prescriptive principle that directs us to try to reform social institutions and social practices as far as possible, to consciously do so in order to bring about as much utility as possible. And that, of course, is Bentham's basic position, as you know. His principle of utility, sometimes called the greatest happiness principle, is that the ultimate test of the rational value of any action or any social practice is its tendency to promote overall welfare. So when we're evaluating social practices and social and political institutions, the fundamental question that we should be asking when we judge them good or bad, according to Bentham, is, does this practice, does this form of conduct, does this institution, does its operation tend towards the greatest happiness of the greatest number? Let me just say a few words about the title of the book that I asked you to look at. It's a book called Deontology by Bentham that was published actually posthumously about 2 or 3 years after he died. Bentham, I think, I might be wrong about this, but I'm fairly sure Bentham actually coined that term. And it's in a way ironic that he calls this book, defending his own view, deontology, because today, if you've ever taken a philosophy course, philosophers today tend to use this term, it's a horrible word, deontological. They tend to use that term to describe strongly non-utilitarian ethical views, especially Kantian ethical views. I don't have time to talk about Kant here, but let's let's just stipulate for present purposes that Kant was the uber anti-utilitarian. And these days, people tend to describe Kantian ethics as a deontological theory. By the way, the word deontology is just a kind of concatenation of the word for kind of logic and understanding, logos, and the Greek word for duty, right, dion. And so on this kind of contemporary rubric, deontological ethics is a form of ethical theory that emphasizes the importance of acting rightly for its own sake without regard to consequences. And Kant is certainly an ethical theorist who fits that bill, because Kant is a rigorist about this. Kant says, no, to act morally just means that we must act on principle. We must do the right thing just because it's the right thing, just because it's our duty, and without regard to its beneficial consequences, right? So to that extent, it's understandable why philosophers today tend to describe anti-utilitarian Kantian type positions in deontological terms. But it's therefore comes as a bit of a surprise that Bentham in this text refers to his principle of utility, which of course, as you can see from what I've been saying about Hume, is all about consequences, because you're asking, well, will this social practice produce a better outcome for as many people as possible in the future, right? That's his basic consequentialist test. He refers to the principle of utility as the great deontological law. And I think that Bentham, not the contemporary philosophers, is actually on the right track here. And it speaks to a very important and often overlooked feature of the classical utilitarian position, which I want to emphasize, because a lot of people get this wrong. Bentham understands the principle of utility as an ultimate rational axiom or rule that he thinks we have to follow for its own sake, just because it is in itself rational. There is nothing further to say about it, right? He just thinks it's self-evident to the light of natural reason that the principle of utility commands our compliance, right? I mean, he just accepts that as being something we ought to do for its own sake. So I think Bentham is absolutely correct to use this term here, and there is a respect in which he is just as much a deontologist as any of his anti-utilitarian Kantian critics. And Bentham's thought here is something like this. What does it mean for an individual to be rational? Well, go back to that passage that I just read to you from the Principles of Morals and Legislation. What it means to be rational, says Bentham, is to avoid our own pain and to promote our own pleasure. And if we think of rational individuals in that way, they regard their own welfare as worth promoting for its own sake, or for our own, or for their own sakes. Right? So Bentham is thus committed to the idea that egoism is at the core of individual rationality. Right? If you're a rational person, then you are oriented towards trying as far as possible to minimize the amount of pain in your life and to maximize the amount of pleasure in your life. This, by the way, is why so often, both in the deontology text and in the Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham identifies asceticism as one of the fundamental opponents of any utilitarian position. Because an ascetic is someone who thinks that denying oneself pleasures is valuable for its own sake, right? And Bentham regards that as just irrational in and of itself, right? He thinks that a person who denies themselves harmless pleasure for no other reason than that, say, they've read a bunch of Christian doctrine and have been told that, for example, masturbation or sex with members of the same sex are somehow wicked or bad, right? When actually these things don't do any harm at all and actually produce quite a bit of good fun, right? He can't understand, and surely all of us sometimes think this way, he can't understand why anyone could possibly think that if, say, masturbation really doesn't do anybody any harm and actually produces quite a lot of pleasure, why on earth would it be rational for us to avoid it? Right? That's why Bentham is so hostile so often to asceticism in general and to its Christian form in particular. He can't stand the Christian propensity to suppress and repress the pursuit of entirely harmless pleasures. And he regards that as simply irrational. And it's irrational for its own sake. That's the sense in which this is a deontological view, and why I think Bentham is correctly describing his view as a deontological position. But as you, of course, will immediately want to say, but egoism is one thing. That may be a rational stance for individuals to take when they're trying to think about how to conduct their own lives. But ethics and political theory are not just concerned with individual choices, they're concerned with the consequence of large-scale social practices, the large-scale effects of norms and attitudes and institutions and belief in virtues and vices and so forth. And Bentham also accepts that, and he regards ethics and political theory as fundamentally oriented towards the consequences of actions and large-scale social practices for everyone, right? So he generalizes this principle of egoism to a kind of collective benevolence or collective prudence, such that ethical and political judgments are about what is to the general advantage, what will promote everyone's overall happiness as far as possible, right? And that gives you the shape of this utilitarian deontological view, because what he's saying is that ultimately we have a rational principle that directs us to produce as much happiness overall and to assess the value of social practices in light of that. So you can see, I hope, that Bentham's utilitarianism presupposes an important analogy, an analogy that many people have questioned, but which is nonetheless central to the utilitarian project. Bentham postulates an analogy between, on the one hand, the picture of a rational individual who is seeking to maximize their own welfare, to minimize the pain they suffer and maximize the pleasure they enjoy. And secondly, or on the other hand, rational societies, rational collectivities aiming to maximize their collective welfare, aiming to maximize the welfare of everyone. And it's key to the utilitarian position that the second of these takes priority over the first, right? The first is individual prudence or egoism, and the second is what gives us utilitarian ethics, or the utilitarian basis for social and political criticism. So for Bentham and the classical utilitarians, this aim of maximizing overall welfare takes priority over what it is rational for self-interested individuals to do. So when there's a conflict between those two things, when what would be good for everyone conflicts with what would be most beneficial for a single individual, utilitarianism asserts that the ethical imperative, maximize overall happiness, should win. Now, that, of course, raises the obvious question: how do Bentham and the utilitarians propose to calculate overall happiness? And I'll talk more about this in the next lecture, because it depends on how Bentham and the utilitarians understood happiness, and I've got a good deal to say about that, but I'll postpone that until the next lecture. The more important and immediate point for now is that Bentham and his fellow utilitarians at this point introduce another basic, but they think self-evident deontological rational rule or rational axiom. They say when we calculate overall happiness, we should assume that the pleasure and pain of each person should count equally, right? As is often said about the utilitarians, although it's very hard to actually find this statement clearly articulated anywhere in Bentham's writing. There's this famous slogan, each to count for one and for none for no more than one, right? So every person's welfare should count equally in the calculation. So that's important to emphasize because it means that classical utilitarianism, as Bentham understood it anyway, has an implicitly egalitarian and democratic impetus. When we compute aggregate welfare, things like race, class, social position, gender, and so forth, none of that should be given any privilege because every human being is considered as an equal with regard to their capacity to experience pleasure and pain, right? A certain amount of suffering or pleasure should count the same whether you're a member of a noble family or whether you're a peasant, right? This is the sense in which classical utilitarianism is a progressive, inclusive theory, although of course it has some other problems which we'll get into. But I want to emphasize this as an independent and fundamental feature of the utilitarian view, and I think, on reflection, a very attractive feature of its view. This kind of egalitarian impartiality. If something makes you happy to a certain extent, that should count equally in a calculation of overall welfare as compared with somebody else who experiences the same amount of pleasure or pain. Okay, I have to stop here because I'm out of time, but that's enough for now. I will continue this in the next lecture. Thank you very much.